All right, so in part two, we're actually going to look at the sign of different trig ratios. Where are they positive and where are they negative? So you actually have to flip ahead a couple of pages in your workbook to page 150 to look at this. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at quadrant 1, quadrant 2, quadrant 3, and quadrant 4, and we're going to create some tables to help us figure out what the sign of x, y, and r in these quadrants are and what the sign of sine, cosine, and tangent are. If you look in quadrant 1, this coordinate x, y is positive. X is positive and y is positive, and so is r. So if we look at y over r, y is positive and r is positive, so sine is positive. Cosine's x over r. X is positive, r is positive, so cosine is positive. And tangent is y over x. Both the x and the y are positive here, so tangent's positive. So in quadrant 1, all trig ratios are positive, sine, cosine, and tangent. If we look at quadrant 2, if we label this triangle, the x is going to be negative because we go along the negative x-axis, and the y is going to be positive because we're going up in the positive direction in y. So if we do sine, which is y over r, y is positive and r is positive. So in quadrant 2, sine is positive. If you look at cosine, which is x over r, well, x is negative and r is positive. So a negative divided by a positive is a negative. And if you look at tangent, tangent's y over x. Well, y is positive and x is negative, so a positive divided by a negative is a negative. So the only thing that's positive in quadrant 2 is sine. So sine is positive in quadrant 2. Cos and tangent are negative. If we go to quadrant 3, we're again going to go along the negative x-axis, and now we're going down, so y is going to be negative also. You're going down the negative y-axis. So if we do y over r in this situation, y is negative, r is positive, so a negative over a positive is a negative. Cosine's x over r, x is negative, r is positive, and so a negative over a positive is a negative. Tangent is y over x. Well, y is negative and x is negative, so a negative divided by a negative is a positive. So the only thing that's positive in quadrant 3 is tangent. And if we look at quadrant 4, we're now going along the positive x-axis, but we're moving down, so we're going along the negative y-axis. So sine being y over r is going to be a negative over a positive, which is a negative. Cosine's x over r. X is positive, y is positive, so cosine's positive. Tangent's y over x. So y is negative, x is positive, so tangent's negative. So the only thing that's positive in quadrant 4 is cosine. So you'll notice there are individual quadrants where sine, cosine, and tangent are positive, and then in quadrant 1, everything's positive. So if we actually flip to the next page, we actually have a rule to help us remember what's positive and what's negative. It's called the cast rule. And what does cast stand for? Well, in quadrant 4, you have a C, cosine's positive. In quadrant 1, you have an A, all things are positive. In quadrant 2, only sine is positive. And in quadrant 3, only tangent's positive. So if you draw a coordinate grid and you fill in cast, you know what is positive in those quadrants. So if we go back up here, it says sine is positive in which quadrants? Well, everything's positive in quadrant 1, and sine is also positive in quadrant 2. You can also get that by looking back at this chart that we created here. You see all things are positive and sine is positive. Cosine is positive. Well, again, everything's positive in quadrant 1. Cosine's positive in quadrant 4. Tangent is positive in 1 and in 3. So now it's going to ask us where are things negative. Well, if sine is positive in quadrants 1 and 2, then sine has to be negative in quadrants 3 and 4. If cosine's positive in 1 and 4, then it has to be negative in 2 and 3. And if tangent's positive in 1 and 3, then it has to be negative in 2 and 4. And it's really important to know which quadrants things are positive and negative in, because that's really going to help us solve trig equations when we get to pure math, or in math 30-1. So if we look at the next grouping, it says, tell me whether or not each of these particular expressions is positive or negative. So if we look at the sine of 340, well, 340 is in quadrant 4. Sine, well, the only thing positive here is cosine, so sine has to be negative. Tangent 227. 227's in quadrant 3. Remember, this is 0, 90, 180, 270, and 360. So 227's in quadrant 3, so tangent is positive in quadrant 3. Sine of 88. 88 degrees is in quadrant 1, so all things are positive in quadrant 1. Cosine 235. 235's in quadrant 3, it's between 180 and 270. In quadrant 3, the only thing that's positive is tangent, so cosine's negative. The cosine of 308, 308's in quadrant 4, and indeed cosine is positive in quadrant 4. And finally, if we look at the tangent of 123 degrees, 123 degrees is in quadrant 2. It's between 90 and 180, and so that means sine is positive there, so tangent is negative. So you should be able to use the cast rule and look at an angle as well as its trig function and tell me, will that angle be positive or negative in that particular quadrant? So, in this last example, it asks us to rewrite these trig ratios or trig functions using an acute angle. So if we look at the sine of 140, if you draw a small coordinate plane, 140 degrees is in quadrant 2. And if you look at the reference angle, the angle between the terminal arm and the x-axis, this reference angle in this quadrant is actually 40 degrees because 140 is the rotation to the terminal arm, and I have to go 40 degrees more to get to 180. Now, it asks us to write this as an acute angle. Now, we're going to write the sine of 40 because 40 is our reference angle, but now we need to decide, is sine positive or negative in that quadrant? Well, if I write out my cast rule, S is in quadrant 2, so sine is positive, so the positive of the sine of 40 will have the same value as if I use the sine of 40 on my calculator. If we go to 323, 323 is down here in quadrant number 4. We need to determine this reference angle. So it's actually going to be 360 minus 323. So we're going to take 360 minus 323 because we're going how much less? We're going 37 degrees less than 360. So in this case, we have the tangent of 37, tangent in quadrant 4. Well, if I look at my cast rule, the only thing that's positive in quadrant 4 is cosine, so that means tangent has to be negative in this case. Okay, let's keep going. If I look at 165, 165 is in quadrant 2. What's this reference angle? Well, it's going to be 180 minus 165, so that's going to give me a reference angle of 15 degrees. So this is cosine of 15 degrees. Now, if I look at the cast rule, in quadrant 2, the only thing that's positive is sine, so that means cos 15 has to be negative in that quadrant. So that's all we're going to do. I think you can handle that. We don't need to do the rest of those examples. So let's get on with an assignment.